Abandoned at the graduation ceremony, I watched everyone celebrate without me. Then something I posted online made them realize what they'd lost. I had spent the better part of my life preparing for that one day, the graduation ceremony that, for most of my classmates, was just another milestone in a string of accomplishments, but for me, it was everything. The final year had been grueling: projects, exams, late nights at the library, and more essays than I could count. But I had endured them all with quiet determination. I had a vision, one that extended far beyond the high walls of our school, and for once, I thought the world would see me. My parents, my teachers, and even my peers, everyone had insisted that graduation would be a proud day, a culmination of all the effort, sweat, and tears. But when the morning of the ceremony arrived, I found myself standing alone outside the auditorium, clutching my diploma in its crisp, official folder, while the crowd filtered in and filled the seats like waves in a storm. I had been abandoned. Not metaphorically, but quite literally. My closest friends, the ones I had shared countless late-night study sessions and whispered conversations with, had found other seats, other groups, other worlds to exist in. Somehow, my presence was invisible to them. I waved awkwardly, thinking they would notice, thinking that someone would at least glance in my direction, but they didn't. They laughed, they hugged, they posed for photos, and I watched from the back of the room, an outsider in the one room that was supposed to celebrate me. The bitterness was immediate, a sharp sting that turned my throat dry and my chest tight. I had always been someone who valued connection, someone who had poured herself into the relationships around her, and yet, in that room, it was as though I had never existed. As the ceremony began, I found a quiet corner at the back, leaning against the cold wall, and tried to keep my composure. I watched the speeches, the awards, the ceremonial handshakes, feeling more like a shadow than a person. Each name that was called, each applause that rang out, felt like a personal reminder of my exclusion. And yet, there was no dramatic confrontation, no overt insult, no moment where someone declared my unworthiness. It was worse than that. It was complete indifference. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that recognition and acknowledgement were fleeting things, and that, in the end, I would have my own triumphs. But even as I said it to myself, even as I recited the mantra in my mind, a hollow ache spread through me. There was a picture being taken at the front, a giant class photo with everyone lined up in perfect rows, smiles wide, gowns flowing, caps perched jauntily on heads. And I was absent from it. I wasn't just left out, I was erased. My heart throbbed in disbelief, a mixture of sadness, anger, and disbelief that the very people I had considered my family in that microcosm of school life could so thoroughly overlook me. After a while, I wandered outside, away from the crowd and the shouting, the cheers, and the echoing music. The courtyard was emptying, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the brick pathways, and I sat down on the edge of a fountain, watching the water ripple in the light. I felt the weight of every unnoticed effort, every late-night sacrifice, every time I had offered help and kindness that had gone unreturned. My diploma rested in my lap, but it felt like a hollow token, a piece of paper that validated nothing if there was no one to witness the achievement. The worst part was not just the absence of people, it was the silence in its wake. No one came to check on me. No one tried to pull me back into the fold, to apologize for whatever invisible slight had been committed. It was as though I had been a ghost all along, haunting the corridors of the school unnoticed. I thought about the countless times I had offered a shoulder to cry on, advice in times of confusion, laughter when spirits were low. I had been present for everyone else, and yet, when it came to my moment of recognition, it seemed that no one had even noticed. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages from that morning, texts that now felt hollow in retrospect. Generic congratulations from people I barely knew, a few emojis from distant acquaintances, and not a single word from those who had mattered the most. My fingers hovered over the screen as I considered sending a message, something pointed, something that would make them realize my presence, my absence, the gravity of being left behind. But I didn't. I didn't because I realized, with a sinking clarity, that if I wanted acknowledgement, I would have to create it myself. The bitter seed of resolve took root in my heart. They had ignored me, cast me aside, and in that act of exclusion, they had handed me the perfect opportunity, not for revenge, necessarily, but for revelation. I would make them see, not in a public spectacle, but in a way that could not be ignored, a way that would resonate louder than applause or shallow congratulations. I wanted them to understand what they had lost, what they had failed to value, and perhaps, just perhaps, to feel the tiniest fraction of the emptiness I had felt all day. Hours passed, and the auditorium emptied, leaving behind only chairs and confetti. The remnants of celebration scattered across the floor like broken promises. I made my way home slowly, carrying my diploma, my phone, and a growing storm of thoughts that churned in my mind. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city streets. I sat at my desk, the diploma in front of me, the phone in hand, and began to type. At first, it was just words, simple recounting of the day of being overlooked, of the cold indifference that had replaced what I had thought was friendship. But soon, the words gained momentum, fueled by the deep well of hurt, disappointment, and determination. I wrote with precision, with honesty, and with the kind of vulnerability that could not be ignored. I recounted names, moments, smiles, and laughs that had been exchanged without me, painting a vivid picture of the day as I had experienced it. I did not write with malice, nor with the intent to shame. Instead, I wrote with clarity, laying bare the reality that had been invisible to them all. Hours passed as I crafted my post, each sentence measured, each paragraph carefully constructed, until finally, I hit publish. It was a message that combined narrative, emotion, and the undeniable truth of my experience, meant not just to express my feelings, but to create a mirror that would reflect their oversight back at them. And then I waited. The night deepened, quiet except for the occasional hum of traffic outside my window, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and apprehension. Would anyone read it? Would anyone care? Would it make a difference? Or would it disappear into the endless stream of online content, unnoticed and unremarkable, just like I had been at the ceremony? I couldn't know, but I did know one thing. I had taken control. For the first time that day, I had reclaimed my narrative, my voice, and my presence. And in that act, I felt the first stirrings of something long dormant inside me. A realization that the power to define my worth and command recognition did not lie in others, but in myself. The next morning, I woke to a world that felt both familiar and entirely different. Overnight, my post had spread, not like wildfire exactly, but like a current quietly forcing its way through channels I hadn't expected. Notifications flooded my phone with a mix of likes, comments, shares, and private messages. Some were from people I barely knew, expressing empathy, encouragement, and admiration. Others were from classmates, friends, and even teachers who had only just realized what had happened the day before. At first, I stared at the screen in disbelief. My heart raced, my hands trembled slightly, not from joy, not exactly, but from the sheer astonishment that my words, my carefully crafted recounting of being ignored, had touched so many. There were comments that stung more than others, those that revealed guilt, regret, or defensiveness. I read one from a classmate whose smile had once been familiar. "I didn't realize, I thought you didn't want to join us. I'm sorry." Another from someone I had considered a close friend. "Wish should have reached out. I can't believe we left you out. You didn't deserve that." The flood of words, mixed with sincere apologies and self-reflection, washed over me, and I felt a strange sense of vindication. Not triumph but validation. My experience, my pain was seen. My presence could no longer be ignored. I spent the morning responding selectively, carefully. I didn't want to start a war, nor did I want to humiliate anyone publicly, though part of me considered it. Instead, I opted for honesty, the kind that cut without cruelty. I thanked those who reached out with genuine concern, offered perspective to those who seemed confused, and subtly highlighted the lessons I hoped they would take from the experience. I wrote with a tone that was firm but not harsh, revealing the depth of hurt I had endured without letting it turn into resentment. With each response, I felt a growing sense of agency. For the first time, I realized that recognition didn't have to be granted at a ceremony or by a crowd. It could be demanded, cultivated, and even created. By noon, the post had garnered attention far beyond my immediate circle. Shares from strangers, friends of friends, even local community members who had ties to our school network began to pile up. Some people sent direct messages asking if they could repost my story in blogs or forums, while others reached out simply to share similar experiences of feeling invisible at pivotal moments. I didn't expect this. I had only wanted my absence to be acknowledged, but now, suddenly, the story had taken a life of its own. It was as though my voice, previously drowned out by the din of social interaction and indifference, had grown into a signal that could not be ignored. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. By mid-afternoon, the impact of the post began to reach into the physical world. My phone buzzed continuously, notifications stacking into a dense stream I could barely keep up with. But then came the calls, messages from family, distant relatives who had seen the post, even a few local journalists intrigued by the human interest angle. My mother was the first to call, her voice shaky. I saw the post. I had no idea it had been like that. I thought everyone was being silly. I didn't know you felt so alone. I'm so sorry. I listened, letting her words sink in. It was the acknowledgement I had longed for, though tinged with the ache of delayed realization. She wanted to make amends, but I could tell that she understood this wasn't about a single apology. It was about a pattern, about the cumulative effect of being overlooked again and again. I didn't chastise her, I simply shared my truth, letting her hear my side without dilution. Later, the messages began arriving from teachers, many expressing shock and regret. One wrote, "I have no excuse. We should have made sure you felt included. I'm so sorry you went through that." Even the principal sent a note of acknowledgement, formal and polite, but genuine in intent, expressing that measures would be taken to ensure no student felt similarly invisible in the future. The realization hit me hard. My quiet, invisible suffering had become visible, unavoidable. People could no longer pretend they didn't see me. My presence had been restored, but it wasn't just me who had changed, it was them, forced into reflection by the starkness of my absence, now made manifest. By evening, the momentum had shifted entirely. Social media threads were alive with debate, empathy, and reflection. Some classmates had begun tagging each other, sharing memories from the ceremony, and slowly, almost awkwardly, they started to acknowledge that the day had not been perfect for everyone. The first of the public apologies appeared, tentative but heartfelt, and I could sense the tension between shame and sincerity. Some admitted their part, others their indifference, and still others their oversight. And as they did, a fascinating transformation occurred. People began reaching out, not for the sake of rectifying a mistake, but for connection, understanding, and reconciliation. I watched messages unfold between classmates, friends of friends, even strangers who felt compelled to share similar experiences. The story of my invisibility had become a lens through which many people began to see themselves and their actions. By nightfall, I felt a mix of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't about making anyone suffer. It was about truth, visibility, and finally, recognition. Sitting alone in my room, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the walls, I realized something profound, the very thing that had hurt me most. The absence, the exclusion, the feeling of being erased, had been transformed into power. Not the power to humiliate, but the power to make people see, reflect, and understand. I had turned silence into a voice, invisibility into a presence. And in doing so, I began to understand the fragile, yet potent, nature of acknowledgement and the unexpected ways it can ripple outward, far beyond the confines of any single moment, or even a single graduation ceremony. The next few days were surreal, a strange blend of confrontation, revelation, and reconciliation that I had never anticipated. My phone remained a constant hum, buzzing and vibrating with notifications that I couldn't keep up with, but I didn't want to mute them. Each ping was a thread of connection, a lifeline to conversations that demanded attention, reflection, and, in many cases, courage. Some classmates reached out privately, apologizing in ways that felt awkward but sincere. "I never realized how excluded you felt. I feel awful." Others attempted explanations, fumbling to account for their absence with excuses that ranged from, "I thought someone else would invite you," to, "We were busy celebrating and didn't think you'd want to come." Each message revealed a sliver of their perspective, a window into their own assumptions and blind spots, and I read them all with careful scrutiny. My responses were deliberate, neither harsh nor overly forgiving, emphasizing the impact of their neglect while acknowledging the effort it took for them to finally confront it. It was a delicate balance, like walking along a knife's edge. I wanted them to understand, but I didn't want to allow pity or superficial remorse to dominate the conversation. I needed authenticity. And for many, the post had forced it out of them. In some ways, the situation transformed me more than it transformed them. I had expected anger, bitterness, and perhaps even a desire for revenge, but what emerged instead was clarity. I realized that my power did not lie in shaming them or making them suffer, but in controlling my own narrative, in asserting my presence and experiences. Their acknowledgement, their apologies, were not necessary for me to recognize my own worth. They were a bonus, a reflection of the value I had always held within myself. I also noticed something unexpected. The post had sparked conversations far beyond my own circles. Former classmates I had barely spoken to were sharing their own stories of feeling invisible, overlooked, or underestimated. Messages from strangers poured in expressing solidarity, recounting parallel experiences, and offering encouragement. One person, a recent graduate from a nearby city, wrote, Reading your post made me realize how often I downplay the accomplishments of those around me. Thank you for putting words to something I've always felt but never voiced. Another shared a story about being ignored during a school award ceremony and how it had shaped their perception of themselves for years. I hadn't intended to become a catalyst for introspection, but in recounting my truth, I had unwittingly opened a doorway for others to step through. The realization was humbling and empowering in equal measure. Meanwhile, the ripple effect within my immediate circle of friends was growing more pronounced. A group of them decided to organize a small gathering to make amends in person. It was awkward at first. There were hesitant smiles, uncertain glances, and more than a few stumbles over words, but gradually, the tension began to ease. We talked about the graduation ceremony, about what had been overlooked, about how assumptions and misunderstandings had compounded into exclusion. Some admitted that they had simply not noticed me, caught up in the excitement and celebration, while others confessed a deeper indifference, a failure to appreciate what my presence had meant. I listened carefully, absorbing their words without judgment, recognizing that the sincerity of their regret mattered more than the comfort of their excuses. We shared stories, laughed at awkward moments, and even reminisced about times when we had been supportive of each other, all of which reminded me that human connections are rarely linear, neat, or perfect. They are messy, sometimes fragile, and yet capable of growth and repair when approached with honesty and care. But it wasn't all smooth reconciliation. There were still fractures that couldn't be mended so easily, and I encountered resistance from some who resented being confronted by the truth of their oversight. One former friend, someone I had once considered inseparable, replied curtly to a private message. "I don't see why this matters so much now. Graduation was a long time ago. Why drag it up?" It was a reminder that not everyone would be willing to acknowledge their role or the pain they had caused, no matter how well-intentioned my post had been. Yet, even in that resistance, I felt a sense of liberation. Their unwillingness to engage did not diminish my achievement or my worth, it merely reflected their own limitations. I had begun to understand, in a profound way, that validation from others is fleeting and unreliable, while the recognition I cultivate within myself is enduring and unshakable. That evening, I sat alone again, reflecting on the whirlwind of attention, apologies, and reflections. My post had not only forced others to confront their actions, but had also illuminated my own resilience, my ability to create impact from a place of hurt, and my capacity to transform exclusion into empowerment. The diploma I had held so tightly at the ceremony now seemed symbolic in an entirely different way, not as proof of academic accomplishment, but as a testament to endurance, self-respect, and the power of voice. By the end of the week, the transformation was unmistakable. Relationships had been recalibrated, some strengthened, others ended, but all had been clarified. The very act of sharing my experience had shifted the dynamic between myself and those around me, creating an environment in which honesty and acknowledgement were no longer optional. My post continued to circulate, sparking dialogue far beyond the original intended audience. It reached distant relatives, former classmates who had moved to other cities, and even educators who used it as a teaching point in discussions about empathy, inclusion, and social awareness. People who had once overlooked me were now engaging in meaningful conversations about the importance of recognizing those around them, and I realized that, in sharing my truth, I had not only reclaimed my voice but had amplified it into a chorus that others could hear. And as the days went on, I began to understand something even deeper. Being abandoned at a moment of celebration had been painful, but it had also been the catalyst for a growth I could never have anticipated. The emptiness I had felt was transformed into connection, insight, and influence, all stemming from a single act of courage, the act of refusing to remain silent. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. What had begun as a quiet, painful exclusion transformed into a complex web of connections, reflections, and reckonings. People continued to reach out, some cautiously, others with heartfelt urgency, seeking dialogue, understanding, or simply acknowledgement. I realized that my story had become a mirror, not only for my peers, but for everyone who encountered it. A mirror in which they could see their own missteps, their own failures to notice, and perhaps their own unrealized potential for kindness. The digital responses began to translate into real-world interactions. Former classmates who had ignored me during the ceremony now approached me at social gatherings, offering genuine conversation rather than casual greetings. Some had brought small gestures, a coffee, a note, a simple acknowledgement, that, while modest, carried weight precisely because they were earned through reflection and effort. I found myself in a strange position, no longer the overlooked, invisible figure at a ceremony, but a person whose voice mattered, whose experience could catalyze awareness and change. This power was not about dominance or revenge, it was the quiet authority of truth spoken and witnessed. One afternoon, a former close friend reached out for a meeting. The message was tentative, almost trembling with unspoken fear. "I'd like to talk in person." "I owe you more than I can say here," I agreed, sitting across from them in a small cafe. The initial awkwardness hung like fog between us. But as the conversation unfolded, their words were honest, laden with regret, and punctuated by pauses where they struggled to articulate the depth of their own oversight. They admitted that they had been caught up in their own lives, in excitement, in assumptions that my presence wasn't necessary. They confessed that they had never considered how exclusion, even unintentional, could feel like erasure. And as they spoke, I realized something important: reconciliation does not erase the past. It does not remove the sting of exclusion or the hours spent feeling invisible. What it does is offer a bridge, a chance for acknowledgement, for restoration, and for moving forward with awareness. I listened, spoke honestly about the hurt I had endured, and for the first time in months, felt a weight lift from my chest. The conversation ended not with a dramatic embrace, but with mutual recognition, a quiet understanding that some bonds, though strained, could be mended through courage, honesty, and reflection. Meanwhile, the impact of my online post continued to ripple outward. Former classmates shared it within professional networks, educators referenced it in discussions about inclusion, and strangers reached out to thank me for articulating what they themselves had experienced but could never express. Some parents of other graduates contacted me to discuss how they could foster awareness and empathy in their children, ensuring that no student felt invisible at pivotal moments. The experience revealed the multiplicative nature of truth. When spoken authentically, it cannot remain contained. One small act, typing words in a quiet room late at night, had cascaded into lessons, reflections, and consciousness for hundreds of people. I realized that the significance of the graduation ceremony was no longer contained in a single day, in a crowd of peers, or even in the recognition of friends. It had become something far larger, a demonstration of the human need to see, acknowledge, and honor each other, and the power inherent in taking one's voice seriously. In the end, I understood that being abandoned at the graduation ceremony, though devastating at the time, had offered an unanticipated gift. I learned that exclusion is often less about personal failings and more about collective inattentiveness, assumptions, and the unnoticed impacts of small choices. I discovered that reclaiming one's narrative is an act of agency, a declaration that one's presence, feelings, and experiences matter regardless of external validation. And I recognized that acknowledgement, once demanded through courage and clarity, can transform relationships, perceptions, and even entire communities. Months later, I attended another gathering of graduates, this time with invitations and affirmations from people who had initially overlooked me. The difference was palpable. The connections were intentional, rooted in reflection rather than convenience, and sustained by honesty rather than assumption. I had become both participant and observer, empowered by the lessons of the past, and fully aware of the responsibility to ensure that no one else felt the quiet ache of being invisible. Sitting quietly afterward, reflecting on the journey, I thought of the post that had changed everything. It had begun as a simple recounting of hurt, a raw expression of being abandoned, and it had grown into something far beyond my initial intention. It had forced visibility, demanded reflection, and inspired empathy, and in doing so, it had rewritten the story of my own presence. No longer was I the student who watched graduation from the edges, erased and unseen. I had become someone whose voice, presence, and experiences were undeniable. The echoes of that day, once bitter, now reverberated as lessons, connections, and quiet triumphs. And as I looked around, seeing people engage honestly, thoughtfully, and with awareness, I understood, fully and completely, that sometimes being overlooked is not the end. It is the beginning of a journey that transforms absence into presence, pain into insight, and silence into a voice that cannot be ignored.